The silence that fell over that restaurant was the kind you don't forget. Not the polite quiet of a room waiting for something to begin, but the suffocating stillness of 200 people holding their breath because someone had just done something unforgivable in public, and everyone knew it, except, perhaps, the person who had done it. My son's name is Marcus. He was 31 years old that evening, standing at the front of a private dining room at a restaurant in Oakville, Ontario, holding a champagne flute in one hand and a small piece of paper in the other. He had written notes. That's the kind of man Marcus is: careful, prepared, never wanting to stumble over his words when the words matter. He had been practicing that speech for 2 weeks. I know because he called me the Sunday before and read it to me over the phone, and I had to press the receiver against my chest for a moment, because I didn't want him to hear that his old father was getting emotional in the kitchen. He loved her. That's what I kept coming back to, through everything that came after. He genuinely, completely loved her. Her name was Sienna Hartwell, 28 years old, a lifestyle content creator with 400,000 followers on Instagram and a brand partnership portfolio her mother liked to describe, unprompted, as diversified. Her mother's name was Diane Hartwell. Diane was 54, recently divorced from Sienna's father, a quiet, kind man named Gerald who I had met exactly once, and who had the look of someone who had spent decades quietly enduring, and she had rebuilt her identity entirely around her daughter's public profile. She managed Sienna's contracts. She sat in on brand calls. She had her own secondary account, titled something like Mom Behind the Brand, with 60,000 followers of her own. She spoke about engagement rates the way some people speak about the weather, constantly, as though it were a shared concern everyone must have. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years with the Ontario Securities Commission, the last 14 as a senior investigator in the Enforcement Division. I reviewed financial disclosures for a living. I traced money through shell companies and numbered corporations and offshore accounts. I was, as my colleagues used to joke, professionally paranoid. When I retired 4 years ago, I took up woodworking and grew tomatoes and drove my daughter to her Saturday morning soccer games and tried, with some success, to become a person who did not automatically scrutinize every financial claim he encountered. Diane Hartwell made that very difficult. I had met her 3 times before the rehearsal dinner. The first time was a Sunday brunch in Burlington, about 8 months after Marcus and Sienna had started dating seriously. Diane arrived 20 minutes late, apologized to Sienna for the delay, and did not apologize to the rest of us. She spent most of brunch discussing a sponsored post Sienna had done for a Canadian skincare brand, breaking down the click-through metrics in a way that suggested she expected us to be impressed. My wife, Margaret God, I still reach for the phone sometimes, to tell her things caught my eye across the table and gave me the smallest smile. We had a language, Margaret and I, 34 years of it. That smile meant, be patient, be kind. She's probably nervous. Margaret died 14 months before the rehearsal dinner. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in February, gone by September. It was fast, and it was brutal, and it left Marcus and me trying to find our footing in a world that had restructured itself entirely without her permission. Marcus threw himself into his relationship with Sienna. I understood that. Grief takes people in different directions. He needed someone to hold on to, and Sienna, whatever else I might have come to think of her mother, was genuinely warm with him in those early months. She flew to Toronto when Margaret was in the hospital. She sat with us. She was present in the way that matters. I gave her a great deal of credit for that. The second time I met Diane was at Christmas, at a dinner Sienna hosted at their shared condo in Etobicoke. Diane pulled me aside near the kitchen and asked me, with apparent sincerity, whether I had considered what I was going to do with my downtime now that the career was finished. I told her I was keeping busy. She nodded in the way people nod when they are not actually listening, and said that Sienna had been connected with a financial wellness influencer who was doing very interesting things with retirement, lifestyle, content, and that perhaps there was an angle there. I spent the rest of that evening in a pleasant conversation with Gerald, who had been invited out of some residual familial obligation, and who spent most of dinner quietly eating his turkey. The third time was an engagement dinner, 6 months before the rehearsal. By then I had noticed a pattern. Diane did not address Marcus directly, unless it was to redirect a statement he had made or to introduce a qualification to something he said. She did it smoothly. She did it with a smile. But she did it consistently, and I had spent enough years in interview rooms to know the difference between someone who is socially awkward and someone who is deliberately managing a dynamic. Marcus noticed too. He mentioned it to me once, on a drive back from Mississauga, in that careful way he has of bringing up something that's bothering him without quite wanting to admit that it's bothering him. He said, "Dad, do you ever get the feeling that Diane thinks I'm temporary?" I told him that wasn't the case. I said it the way you say things to your children when you know the truth, but the truth isn't useful yet. The rehearsal dinner was held on a Friday evening in late October. The restaurant was a well-regarded Italian place in downtown Oakville, the kind with exposed brick and dim candlelight and menus without prices. Diane had chosen it. She had chosen most things about the wedding. I had come to understand. The venue, the photographer, the florist, the menu for the reception. Marcus had told me that Sienna deferred to her mother on most decisions, and that he had picked his battles. He had gotten them to agree on the honeymoon location, Prince Edward Island, because Sienna had never been and Marcus had gone as a child with Margaret and me, and had never forgotten it, and he felt that was a reasonable win. I drove down from Brampton alone. I wore the gray suit Margaret had helped me pick out for my nephew's wedding 3 years earlier. I arrived 10 minutes early, as I always do, and stood near the entrance and watched the room fill up. Sienna's side of the family arrived with a kind of coordinated energy. The women in particular, cousins and aunts, and a few friends Diane introduced as part of our community, which I gathered meant people who followed Sienna's content. There was a photographer circulating. Not for the event, I realized, but for content. Diane had arranged for someone to document the rehearsal dinner for Sienna's social media. Marcus had not mentioned this to me. I suspected he hadn't known. Marcus arrived with his 2 closest friends, Dev and Patrick, and he found me near the bar and hugged me and said I looked good, and I told him the same, and both of us were telling the truth, in the general direction of a lie, because we were both thinking about the person who should have been standing next to me. He knew it. I knew it. We moved past it the way you learn to do. Dinner was seated. I was placed at a table with 2 of Diane's friends and a cousin of Sienna's who worked in marketing and who spent the first course explaining the distinction between macro and micro influencers in a way that assumed I had asked. The food was genuinely excellent. I focused on that. Diane gave a toast early in the evening. It was polished. It was clearly rehearsed. She spoke about Sienna's journey. She used the word journey twice, and about the brand they had built together, and about how proud she was of the woman Sienna had become. She mentioned Marcus in 2 sentences near the end, described him as a steady presence, and sat down to applause. Then Marcus stood up. He smoothed the piece of paper against his palm. He looked out at the room, 200 people, candles, his whole life arranged in front of him, and he began to speak. He said that he had been trying to find the right words for months, and had finally understood that the right words were simply the true ones. He said that he had lost his mother the year before, and that grief had taught him not to wait to say the important things. He was talking about Sienna, about what she meant to him. His voice was steady. I was watching him with the specific pride that is almost indistinguishable from heartbreak, the way you feel when your child becomes something beyond what you could have planned for them. He was perhaps 90 seconds in when Diane interrupted him. She did it with a laugh. That was what made it so effective. It was framed as warmth, as affection. She said, loud enough for the tables nearby to hear clearly, "Marcus, sweetheart, we love you, but public speaking has never quite been your strong suit, has it? Why don't you wrap it up and let the professionals handle the toasts?" She gestured to herself as she said it. Some people laughed. The people who didn't know better. The people who knew better did not. Marcus stopped speaking. He stood there for 3 seconds, I counted, the way you count things when you are trying not to feel them, and then he folded his piece of paper and smiled and sat down. The smile did not reach anywhere near his eyes. I set down my wine glass. I want to be clear that I am not a man who acts on impulse. I have spent 31 years in a profession where impulsive action gets cases thrown out and careers ended. What I felt in that moment was not rage. Rage is hot and urgent and loud. What I felt was something much cooler and much more deliberate. It was the feeling I used to get when I found the first anomaly in a financial document, a quiet, precise recognition that something was wrong here, and that the wrongness had a shape, and that the shape was something I knew how to trace. I reached for my phone, and I made a note. That was all. I made a note. The evening continued. Marcus recovered himself the way he always does, with quiet, effortful grace, talking to guests, laughing at the right moments, being the person he has always been. I watched Diane work the room. She was good at it. She moved through the space with the ease of someone who has spent years curating her own image, who has learned to be the most interesting presence in any conversation. She stopped at several tables. The photographer followed her. I stopped at Gerald near the end of the night, who was nursing a scotch near the window and watching the street below. "She's always been like that," he said, without my asking. He seemed to know what I was thinking, or perhaps he had simply been waiting for years for someone to stand near him without pretending they hadn't noticed. "How long?" I asked. He considered. "It got worse when Sienna's account started growing. About 4 years ago. Once there was money in it. Real money." Diane, he paused, chose his words, reorganized her priorities. "What kind of money are we talking about?" He shook his head. "More than she should have, given what gets reported." I looked at him. He looked at the street. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. I drove home to Brampton that night and sat at the kitchen table that Margaret had picked out at a shop in Guelph on a rainy Saturday in 2009, and I opened my laptop. I want to be clear again about what I was and was not doing. I was not looking for something to use against Diane Hartwell. I was not planning anything. I was doing what I had always done when something didn't sit right. I was looking at the shape of it. Sienna Hartwell had, according to her publicly available media kit, which her mother had apparently posted on a business development website, approximately 412,000 Instagram followers, 90,000 on YouTube, and a secondary TikTok presence. The media kit listed her brand partnership history, which included several recognizable Canadian companies and a number of smaller skincare and wellness brands. It described her business entity as Hartwell Creative Incorporated, incorporated in Ontario. Ontario incorporation records are public. I looked up Hartwell Creative Incorporated. It was incorporated 3 years earlier. Diane Hartwell was listed as a director. This was not unusual. What was slightly unusual was that the registered business address was a numbered unit in a commercial mail center in Mississauga rather than a home office or commercial space. Also not unusual on its own, but it was a shape. I spent 2 hours looking at shapes. I found a second corporation, Hartwell Brand Partners Incorporated, incorporated 18 months after the first. Different address, a law office in Etobicoke. The director listed was a numbered company, which is permitted under Ontario corporate law. The numbered company resolved, after some navigation through the public registry, to a holding company whose listed director was a name I did not recognize. Cynthia Morel. I noted that name. I did not find Cynthia Morel in any of Sienna's public content. I did not find her in any of Diane's public content. I found her, after some time, in a court filing from 2019, a civil matter in Ontario, Superior Court, unrelated to the Hartwells, in which she had been named as a witness. Her address in that filing was a condominium building in Etobicoke. The same building, I found with a few more searches, in which Diane Hartwell's condo was registered. Cynthia Morel was Diane Hartwell's sister. This is not illegal. Family members direct companies for each other all the time. But the structure, 2 corporations, a holding company, a related party director, obscured behind a numbered company, was the kind of structure I had spent years looking at in a professional context. It was the kind of structure you build when you want to move money between entities in a way that is difficult to trace at first glance. I noted the structure, then I stopped, because it was past midnight, and I was 63 years old, and I had woodworking to do in the morning. Over the next 6 weeks, in the hours between other things, I continued to look. I am precise about this, because I want to be honest. I was not obsessed. I was not consumed. I went to Marcus's hockey game on a Wednesday evening and cheered loudly when he scored and did not think about Diane Hartwell once. I had dinner with my daughter Renata and her husband in Hamilton and talked about their new house and barely thought about it. But when I sat at the kitchen table in the evenings, I looked. What I found, slowly, was a pattern of advertising disclosure that did not comply with the requirements of the Competition Act and the guidelines published by the Competition Bureau of Canada. Sponsored content on Sienna's platforms, some of it quite clearly paid promotion for Canadian health products, was not consistently labeled as such. This is a regulatory matter in Canada, increasingly taken seriously. But more than that, the revenue flowing through the corporate structure appeared, based on what I could piece together from public financial filings, tax credit claims, and CRTC registered business information, to significantly underrepresent the income being generated. I am not a tax lawyer. I want to be clear about that. But I had spent a career working alongside tax lawyers and forensic accountants, and I knew what a referral looked like. I had a contact at the Canada Revenue Agency's Compliance Division. We had worked on 3 cases together over the years. Her name was Paulette, and she was thorough and fair and did not take things personally, which in my experience is the rarest quality in any enforcement professional. I sent her an email on a Tuesday morning in December. I said I had come across a corporate structure in my personal research that appeared to present some indicators worth a preliminary look, and I attached a document I had prepared 14 pages, organized by entity, with public source citations for every claim. I said I had no personal stake in the outcome, and that she should use her own judgment about whether it warranted attention. Then I went to the garage and worked on a bookshelf I was building for Renata's living room. I did not tell Marcus. This is the thing I have thought about most in the time since. I did not tell him because I was not certain of anything, and because certainty matters. I had flagged a concern to a regulatory authority, and that authority would make its own determination. I had not accused anyone of anything. I had simply described shapes and let people whose job it was to look at shapes do their jobs. The wedding was in April. It was a Saturday, and the weather was what April weather in Ontario usually is, optimistic in the morning and non-committal by the afternoon. The ceremony was at a vineyard property outside Niagara-on-the-Lake. It was beautiful. Sienna was beautiful. Marcus stood at the front of the room and watched her walk toward him, and his face was the face of someone receiving more than they had known how to ask for. And I thought, whatever happens, this moment is real. Whatever happens after, this moment will have been true. Diane Hartwell gave a speech at the reception. It was longer than Marcus's speech had been at the rehearsal dinner. I drank my wine and smiled at the right moments and drove home to Brampton, feeling mostly tired. Paulette emailed me in June. She thanked me for the referral and confirmed that the matter had been reviewed internally and referred to the appropriate team. She could not share details of any resulting action, as I would have expected. She said the documentation I had provided had been organized clearly and had been helpful in the preliminary assessment. She wished me well in my retirement. I noted the email and went back to the bookshelf. The first indication I had that something was happening came from Marcus, who called me on a Thursday evening in August, 4 months after the wedding. He said that Sienna had come home very upset, that Diane had called, and there were apparently some issues with the business, some kind of inquiry, and he didn't know the details, but Sienna was stressed and he didn't know how to help her. I listened. I said the right things. I said I was sure it would work out, and to give Sienna my love. I did not tell him. Not then. What emerged over the following months, in the way these things emerged through Sienna telling Marcus, who told me pieces of it in fragments, and through what eventually became public reporting, was that Hartwell Creative Incorporated and Hartwell Brand Partners Incorporated were the subject of a CRA audit that had expanded into a broader compliance review. The Competition Bureau had separately been in contact regarding advertising disclosure practices. Sienna's major brand partners, who monitor this sort of thing closely because their own compliance depends on it, began quietly declining to renew contracts. Within 6 months of that first call from Marcus, Sienna's income had been reduced significantly. Within 8 months, Diane had retained a tax lawyer and a communications professional. The communications professional did not help much. The story moved through the particular ecosystem of Canadian lifestyle media, the blogs that cover influencer culture, the podcasts that discuss creator economy with more speed than I would have predicted. The corporate structure, once examined, told a story that did not require much interpretation. The income that had been routed through holding companies and related party entities, the advertising that had been presented as organic endorsement, the brand deals that had been structured in ways that obscured their financial nature. It all had a shape, and the shape was legible to anyone who had reason to look. I do not know the final dollar figure of what was at stake. I have seen estimates in the range of $2 million to $4 million in unreported or misdisclosed revenue over a 3-year period. I cannot confirm those numbers. I can say that Hartwell Brand Partners Incorporated was dissolved within the year, and that Hartwell Creative Incorporated, underwent a significant restructuring, and that Diane Hartwell no longer appears in Sienna's public content or in any listed business capacity. Marcus and Sienna separated in the spring of the following year. This was not, as far as I can tell, a direct result of the business trouble. It was more complicated than that. Sienna had spent years in a structure that her mother had built and managed, and when that structure came apart, so did some of the certainties Sienna had organized her life around. She and Marcus grew in different directions. These things happen. They were kind to each other in the ending of it, from what Marcus has told me, and I am grateful for that. He called me one Sunday in May, after the separation was settled, and we talked for a long time about his mother, about what she would have thought of all of it, the good parts and the hard parts together. I told him that she would have been proud of how he carried himself through it. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Dad, did you know about the Hartwell stuff before it came out?" I was quiet for a moment, too. "I had a concern," I said. "I reported it to the right people. That's all I did." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to carry it," I said, "and because I wasn't certain. You don't accuse people on suspicion. You give the suspicion to the people whose job it is to confirm or deny it." He said he understood. I think he did. I sold the house in Brampton last year. Too much space for one person. And the kitchen table had started to feel less like a gathering place and more like a reminder of everything gathered there that was no longer present. I bought a smaller place in Guelph, near a park where I walk in the mornings, and I finished Renata's bookshelf and started a new project, a rocking chair, the kind Margaret always said she wanted for the back porch. Marcus is doing well. He's been promoted at work, moved to a new apartment in Kitchener, started playing hockey again on Wednesday nights with a new group. He called me last week to tell me he'd met someone. He sounded the way he used to sound, before everything lighter, present, interested in what came next. I told him I was glad. I am 63 years old, and I have learned that the most dangerous assumption you can make about a person is that they are exactly what they present themselves to be. Diane Hartwell built a careful, polished image of success, of expertise, of a woman who understood how value was created in the modern economy. She had 400,000 people who saw only the surface of that image, and she had organized her entire financial life around the certainty that the surface was all anyone would ever examine. She had never met anyone who did what I did for a living. She had never sat across from a man who understood that the most important information is almost never the information that's being offered. It's the information that's been carefully placed just out of frame. The rocking chair is coming along. The joints are tricky. I've had to redo one of the rear legs twice, which is frustrating, but the wood is good oak and it deserves to be done right. Margaret would have told me to stop fussing and just finish it. She would have been wrong, but I would have listened to her anyway, because some voices stay with you even when there's no one there to carry them. There's a lesson in this, if you want one. Actually, there are a few. The first is that competence doesn't announce itself. The most capable people in any room are often the quietest ones, because they've long since stopped needing anyone else's acknowledgement to know what they're worth. Diane Hartwell looked at a retired man in a gray suit and saw someone to manage, someone whose professional life was behind him, someone who could be safely condescended to. She was so committed to her own narrative about who mattered and who didn't that she could not conceive of a threat from that direction. That was her real mistake, not the financial structure, not the disclosure failures. It was the certainty that she understood everyone in the room. The second is that protecting the people you love doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like patience, like documentation, like knowing when to act and when to wait and when to hand the matter to someone with the authority to handle it properly. I did not go to that rehearsal dinner looking to protect anyone. I went to celebrate my son. Diane Hartwell made a choice that evening, and that choice showed me a shape, and I knew what to do with a shape. The third is the one that stays with me most. When I sit at the kitchen table in Guelph in the evenings, and the park outside goes quiet. It is simply this: the people who work quietly, who do their jobs with care, who don't post about it, or announce it, or require an audience, those people are not diminished by the absence of attention. They are, in fact, precisely what makes the world function. They were there before the cameras arrived. They'll be there long after. Be careful who you dismiss, not because they might retaliate, but because the dismissal itself will cost you something, a narrowing of your own understanding, a brittleness in your certainty, a blindness to what's actually in front of you. The most boring job in the world, my old colleague used to say, is the one that prevents the most spectacular disasters. He meant it as a joke. I've come to think he was describing something true. Marcus sent me a photo last week. Him and the new person they went to, Prince Edward Island, for a long weekend, stayed near Cavendish, walked the red sand beaches that Margaret and I had walked with him when he was 7 years old and had just learned to skip stones. He's smiling in the photo the way he smiled before he learned all the things grief teaches you. Not unknowing, just forward, looking at what's next. That's enough. That's more than enough. I've got a rocking chair to finish.